Chapter 38, Section 2, Nixon's Dilemma, Achieving Peace with Honor. President Nixon entered the White House with a mandate to change the course of the Vietnam War. To that end, he relied heavily on his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. Nixon and Kissinger drew two basic conclusions about Vietnam. First, they agreed that the war was not winnable, at least in the conventional sense. U.S. forces could not fight their way into Hanoi the way that Allies had entered Berlin in World War II. The political costs and the cost in American lives would be too great. Second, they decided that the United States could not just cut and run. An abrupt withdrawal from Vietnam would damage U.S. credibility by showing both friends and foes that the United States could not be trusted to stand by its allies. Instead, Nixon sought to achieve peace with honor. He wanted to end the war in a way that left the reputation of the United States intact. Nixon decided on a carrot and stick approach, a tactic that combines actions that reward, the carrot, with actions that punish, the stick. Using this approach, he hoped to persuade the North Vietnamese to accept a negotiated end to the war. The carrot, peace talks and Vietnamization. Peace talks had begun in Paris in May 1968, but little progress had been made. In 1969, Nixon sent Kissinger to Paris to reopen talks with North Vietnamese diplomats. Kissinger proposed ending the bombing of the North, the carrot, in exchange for an agreement by both sides to withdraw their troops from South Vietnam. But he insisted that the South Vietnam remain independent. The North Vietnamese rejected this offer as a farce, saying they were prepared to remain in Paris until the chairs rot. When diplomacy failed to bring about peace with honor, Nixon decided to try another approach known as Vietnamization. South Vietnam, he said, would gradually take over conduct of the war, while American GIs would steadily be withdrawn. In this way, Nixon could offer the carrot of troop reductions to North Vietnam, while easing anti-war tensions at home. Vietnamization was part of a broader Asian policy that called for each American ally to accept primary responsibility for providing soldiers for its own defense. The number of U.S. troops in Vietnam peaked in March 1969 at 543,000. By the end of the year, more than 60,000 of those soldiers would be withdrawn. The plan for Vietnamization set three main goals for South Vietnam: self-government, self-development, and self-defense. According to this plan, political reforms, including local elections, would increase popular participation in government and provide for essential public services. Rural development would bring economic opportunity to the countryside, while pacification would create local defense forces to take charge of village security. U.S. officials believed that strengthening South Vietnam's military forces was key to making Vietnamization work. Training schools were expanded. Pay for soldiers in South Vietnam's army, ARVN, was increased. Living conditions in military camps were improved. So many U.S. ships, planes, helicopters, and vehicles were shipped to Vietnam that one congressman wondered whether the goal of Vietnamization was to put every South Vietnamese soldier behind the wheel. The stick, widening the air war and invading Cambodia. Vietnamization would be a long process, and many American officials were pessimistic about its prospects. Meanwhile, negotiations in Paris were proving fruitless. The carrot offered by the United States, U.S. troop withdrawals and an end to the bombing, did not satisfy the North Vietnamese. Nixon considered several military options to pressure North Vietnam to negotiate, including bombing its industrial areas, mining its harbors, and invading its territory. His strategy, which he called the madman theory, was to make North Vietnam's leaders and their allies, the Soviet Union and China, believe that he would do anything to win the war. He even briefly put nuclear forces on alert as a bluff that he might use tactical nuclear weapons, small but highly destructive nuclear bombs. Nixon had already shown a willingness to expand the war. In March 1969, he had secretly ordered B-52s to begin bombing Cambodia, a neutral nation on Vietnam's western border. For the next 4 years, U.S. bombers would strike communist base camps and supply lines in Cambodia. With Vietnamization, U.S. ground forces began focusing more on intercepting supplies from the north and less on fighting guerrillas in the south. Nixon also decided to give those ground forces another mission. In April 1970, he ordered U.S. troops to invade Cambodia. The military goal of the invading U.S. forces was to destroy enemy safe havens from which North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong forces could launch assaults into South Vietnam. The political goal, said Nixon, was to show the enemy that we were still serious about our commitment to Vietnam. The invasion was a partial success. The GIs destroyed enemy bases and relieved pressure on ARVN forces fighting in the South. But the invasion did not help the peace process. The communists boycotted the Paris talks until U.S. troops left Cambodia 3 months later. In November 1971, Nixon launched a similar invasion of Laos, another neighboring country, after years of bombing had failed to dislodge the communists. By now, the steady withdrawal of GIs had left fewer than 175,000 U.S. combat soldiers in Vietnam. ARVN troops carried out the ground fighting in Laos, with U.S. air support. However, a large, well-equipped NVA force easily defeated the ARVN, forcing them to retreat. So far, Vietnamization had failed to prove its worth on the battlefield.